This is the trial in which 9 men were sentenced to death. They were hanged in secret, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves. One of the men's widows, Esther Kiobel, is arguing that the oil multinational Shell colluded in the violent abuses carried out by the Nigerian state that culminated in the execution of her husband.
I still feel pain in my heart that my husband was killed, and I need justice for him and my people.
At Amnesty International, we've been through a vast cache of internal Shell records from this period, and we believe that they demonstrate a troubling relationship between the company and the Nigerian government.
After 22 years of fighting, Esther is taking Shell to court. Deep ties between Shell and the Nigerian state began when oil was discovered in the country in 1956. The state needed the vast wealth generated by Shell's oil production, and Shell needed access to the oil fields.
Oh my God, they have very tight relationship. When you see government, you see Shell.
One of Shell's key production areas was Ogoniland, found in the oil-rich Rivers State in the southeast of the country.
They cause pollution in Ogoniland, and they refuse cleaning. They just want gain. They needed bigger gain.
You had pollution on a regular basis. You have the destruction of farmlands and the waters. People were falling sick because of the environmental damage.
In 1990, the Ogoni people formed a peaceful protest group called the Movement of the Survival of Ogoni People, or MOSOP. Its leader was the internationally renowned writer, Ken Saro-Wiwa.
We are going to demand our rights peacefully, non-violently, and we shall win.
In 1993, MOSOP demanded that Shell pay the Ogoni people $10 billion in compensation for oil spills and royalties in oil pumped from under the soil. They held a mass demonstration and declared that unless they paid, Shell could no longer operate.
Shell is declared persona non grata in Ogoni.
Shortly after, Shell pulled out of Ogoniland, citing security concerns. From that point forward, the Nigerian government was determined to defeat the protests and prevent them from spreading.
People were arrested recklessly and indiscriminately. People were subjected to constant harassment, constant intimidation, and constant violations of basic human rights.
Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reported on the gross abuses, but this did not deter Shell from pressuring the government to help them resume operations. Records of a meeting between Shell managers and the Nigerian government on the 18th of March 1993 show that Shell insisted that the army guard their contractors against protests from local communities. These soldiers shot and wounded 11 people at Bayara village on the 30th of April, and then shot dead a protester on the 4th of May at Nonwa village. In the same meeting, Shell advised that the army keep protesters imprisoned, so that they could be used as leverage at a later date.
We know from going through Shell's internal documents that executives understood very well the risks of inviting the Nigerian army to guard its contractors who are laying this pipeline. But despite this, they still insisted that the operations go ahead.
In October 1993, Shell attempted to return to Ogoniland and went to inspect its oil wells. The government provided a military unit to accompany it. This team was led by Major Paul Okuntimo. On the 23rd, there was a clash with protesters. The army shot several of them. Mossop said that 2 were killed, although the army denied this, saying that the protesters had been violent. Shell later made a payment to Okuntimo and his men for this mission. This was not a regular payment, but as Shell claimed in another internal document as a
show of gratitude and motivation for a sustained favourable disposition towards Shell in future assignments.
They were really buying the special forces for future assignments and to make sure that they would keep doing their favours. And they were really not sending a signal that killing people is out of the order.
Paul Okuntimo went on to command the military campaign in Ogoni land.
It was a brute. It was very sadistic. As far as he was concerned, he had a job to do, and that job was to harass the people. And if possible, wipe them out of existence. It was so horrible.
Paul Okuntimo has always maintained that any use of force was justified and has denied that any human rights abuses took place. Shell funded a unit of the Nigerian police force whose stated purpose was solely to guard Shell's people and property. Court records have revealed that this unit had an intelligence-gathering team which collated information on anti-Shell demonstrations and protests. Shell's head of security in the region has admitted that he shared information with the Nigerian security forces on a daily basis.
What's so extraordinary about this isn't just that Shell, a private company, should have such a unit in the first place, but also that Shell shared the information that they gathered with the Nigerian security forces at a time that Shell executives knew very well that they were committing serious human rights abuses.
Through a series of meetings, Shell again encouraged the government to resolve the Ogoni crisis, making very clear the economic consequences if the authorities didn't act. Brian Anderson, Shell Nigeria's chairman, held a private meeting on the 30th of April 1994 with President Sani Abacha, who had taken over the country in a military coup, in which he
raised the problem of the Ogonis and Ken Saro-Wiwa, pointing out Shell had not been in the area for almost a year. We told him of the destruction that they had created at our sites, of which he was apparently unaware. I made the point that we were long-term players and that we were prepared to continue to invest so long as we felt there was political stability.
It was shortly after this that a brutal crime handed the state the perfect opportunity to take control of the deepening chaos and silence its critics. Barinem Kiobel was from the Ogoni people. He studied for a PhD in the UK and returned to Nigeria, where he was appointed as a minister in the state government.
He was a good father, a good man, a good leader to his communities.
On the 21st of May, 1994, he was in Ogoni land for a meeting. When he arrived, he heard that a violent clash was underway in a neighbouring village. He went to the scene to try and calm the crowd, but was forced to flee. This dangerous mob had turned on 4 prominent Ogoni chiefs that were critics of Ken Saro-Wiwa and murdered them.
Kobani blood, look at it.
Their bodies were dragged into a car and incinerated.
Before the commencement of any investigation whatsoever, the then military governor of the state, Como, addressed a press conference and did announce that we are going to hold the leadership of Mossop responsible for the killings in Gyoku.
I have directed all the villages there that took part must be rounded up Most leadership that was part of this game must be arrested, and the security forces are out doing just that.
He provided no evidence to support his accusation. Hundreds of people were arrested and detained. 15 were eventually charged, including Mossop leader Ken Saro-Wiwa and Dr. Kiobel.
We can only guess why Barinem Kiobel was part of that group that was arrested. He was not, unlike most of the others, involved with Mossop. What we do know is that in his position as commissioner, he had been critical of how the regime was approaching Mossop. And we can only suspect that that is also the reason why they thought that he should be arrested as well.
The prosecution alleged that Barinem Kiobel whispered into the ears of some of the attackers, and from that they inferred that he had actually directed the killings.
On the basis of this flimsy accusation, Dr. Kiobel was charged with inciting murder. Amnesty International released several urgent actions, stating that Ken Saro-Wiwa and Barinem Kiobel were imprisoned for their political beliefs, spurring our supporters to campaign for their release. With Mossop leadership and their critics detained, Major Paul Okuntimo began Operation Restore Order in Ogoni Land. The army rounded up hundreds of people. Soldiers tortured prisoners and raped women and girls. They set fire to people's houses and shot unarmed villagers. One of the stated purposes of the operation was to ensure those carrying out business ventures within Ogoni land are not molested, a move to ensure that Shell could resume operations. As the area was effectively turned into a military zone, the defendants faced an increasingly abusive detainment.
The men were arrested in May 1994, but it was only in February of 1995 that they were officially charged and allowed to see their lawyers for the very first time. And throughout this period, and then following that during the trial, they continued to be mistreated. They were held in appalling conditions in prison. Some of the men complained of being beaten, others of being tortured. Even on one occasion, their lawyers were beaten by the military.
I was assaulted by soldiers whom we could identify. And when we reported to the tribunal, they said, well, you know.
Representing a number of NGOs, a British lawyer observed the trial and concluded it was unfair.
So the first concern is that the government deliberately took this case out of the ordinary court system and gave it to what was called a civil disturbance tribunal, where it was the government who appointed the judges. So the fear was that this was going to be a tame tribunal which would deliver verdicts in accordance with what it thought the government wanted, rather than in accordance with the evidence.
It wasn't a trial, it was at best a deliberate move by the government to liquidate them. It wasn't a trial.
It seemed to me that of 15 defendants who were charged with murder, there was probably evidence only against 1 or 2 of them, even on the papers in the case. Indeed, some of the defendants were not even mentioned in the papers at the prosecution.
The families of the accused also faced such intense discrimination and abuse during the trial that Dr. Kiobel was forced to speak up.
Even my family at home and the secretary to the chief of my village is being chastised by the armed forces. If justice is to be done, I plead the tribunal to look into that. Let it be played for the whole world to see, so that whatever decision you take, your justice will be left.
My lingering recollection is of a kind of gnawing, sick concern that this was an injustice waiting to happen. In other words, that a number of people were going to be arbitrarily and unfairly convicted and sentenced to death.
On the 30th of October, to international condemnation, the court sentenced Ken Saro-Wiwa, Barinem Kiobel and 7 others to death.
They were locked up, refused them from food, refuse them seeing their family because they believe they've sentenced to death, they're already dead, they're already condemned. They were secretly taken to where they were going to be killed without announcement. Nobody knows about it. So the prison one, they called me, oh, your husband said you have to pick up his stuff. So I took it and I was just screaming, crying. Is this true that you guys already killed my husband, he's gone? And some of them were just telling me the story, what happened before my husband died. They say your husband, hey, you, when I'm by myself, no, I always remember the period. I just see that when I look at it, look up as if everything coming up fresh.
The internal Shell records that we've been through show that executives encouraged the Nigerian government and military to deal with these Ogoni protests. We believe that the evidence demonstrates that these executions were one of the key ways in which the Nigerian regime responded to this encouragement from Shell.
Shell has responded to our allegations, stating,
"The allegations are false and without merit. Shell Nigeria did not collude with the military authorities to suppress community unrest and in no way encouraged or advocated any act of violence in Nigeria. We have always denied these allegations in the strongest possible terms."
Esther has fought hard for 22 years. She was made a refugee and had her initial legal attempts fail on jurisdiction grounds. But now she and 3 other widows have their chance to make Shell face its troubled past in a Dutch court.
Don't you worry.
Ogoni land suffered greatly after the executions and continues to feel the effects of the deep injustice today.
Since you happen to die in most of struggle, never worry, we shall meet again.
No company, however rich, however strong, however powerful, should be above the law. We've been through all of the evidence and we believe that Shell does have a case to answer.